Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. Göbekli Tepe is arguably the most fascinating ancient site in the world, and with more and more research, for me it just gets even more fascinating. But I've noticed there are many errors that are often repeated on the internet. So, in this video, I'll be giving you the facts and best ideas based on evidence as I tackle 4 common misconceptions. Going forward, if we do want to make sense of Göbekli Tepe, it is really important we have good solid background knowledge. Misconception number 1. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. In southeastern Anatolia, there are similar sites to Göbekli Tepe that are much older, and also some that are younger. Some have clear evidence of early crop domestication and animal husbandry, aka agriculture, and some that were clearly occupied by people that hunted and gathered their food. Göbekli Tepe is not the oldest site in the region, but it is early, starting life in the pre-pottery Neolithic A, which runs from approximately 9600 to 8700 BC. It's at this time that the famous semi-subterranean oval enclosures were built, and these are around 10 to 20 metres in diameter, and these have the numerous decorated T-shaped pillars around the perimeter, and each enclosure has 2 in the centre. The purpose and function of these structures is still somewhat unknown, and as many of you know, it does remain hotly debated. And although there is a lack of domestic finds from this early period, it is very possible, or I'd say even likely, that Göbekli Tepe was the site of an early permanent settlement, or at least a seasonal camp from day one. And that's because the experts now agree that Göbekli Tepe was a settlement in the early to mid pre-pottery Neolithic B, between 8700 and 8200 BC. In this period, rectangular structures were built surrounding the nucleus of the older circular enclosures, and these do show signs of domestic activity and even have subfloor burials. There was even a wall that was built, and this separated the 2 types of structure. This doesn't mean there were 2 different cultures at the site, living in 2 different time periods. These are not 2 specific phases of activity, it's just archaeological classification. In truth, Göbekli Tepe was constantly evolving. The circular enclosures were always the nucleus. They were long-lived, likely over several centuries, and they were used through the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B periods. They saw many different phases of activity, repairs, renovations and rebuilding, and there is clear evidence that some of the stone pillars were recycled from earlier phases of work and even from different enclosures. We must remember that today we are not seeing the circular enclosures as they were first constructed in the pre-pottery Neolithic A. We are seeing them as they ended up when the site was abandoned in later history. Maybe the beautiful relief carvings were added to plain limestone T-shaped pillars hundreds of years after the first enclosures were built, maybe during renovations. We don't know and can probably never know, but we can't simply assume the reliefs are original features. We know that some T-shaped pillars were replaced, some were brought from one enclosure to furnish another, and one of the central pillars in enclosure A is even turned the wrong way. So, as a site, Göbekli Tepe was constantly evolving over many centuries of occupation. And just because the surrounding settlement, i.e. the rectangular buildings around the circular enclosures, came later, being built in the pre-pottery Neolithic B, it doesn't mean there was not a settlement or camp from day one. The later domestic buildings could have been built over an even older settlement, maybe more than once. And we simply don't see it, because today we are looking at Göbekli Tepe in its final days, before the site went out of use. The experts have not yet looked beneath the rectangular domestic structures, and there could well be evidence of an older settlement underneath, dating back to the earliest time period, maybe even older. Our knowledge and understanding of the chronology of events at Göbekli Tepe will just get better and better as the archaeologists continue their work. So, to summarise the first point, we have circular enclosures that were in use throughout the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B, which were surrounded by a settlement that dates to the later pre-pottery Neolithic B, and we can't discount the idea that this settlement was built over an earlier one. Either way, there is evidence that Göbekli Tepe was a settlement. Misconception number 2. Göbekli Tepe was a temple. I think to the layperson in the 21st century, the media soundbites give the impression that Göbekli Tepe was a big ancient temple, with many authors giving special attention to the decorated T-shaped pillars, with the most important one being Pillar 43 because of the intricate iconography on display. We are given the impression it was a ritual site high on a hill, untouched after its construction, and then mysteriously and ritually filled in for reasons unknown. But this really is not the case. In my opinion, it is most likely there was always a camp or permanent settlement at Göbekli Tepe, which grew in size and scale from its origins in the pre-pottery Neolithic A and well into the pre-pottery Neolithic B, continually being modified, and although it is thought the circular enclosures were not domestic in nature, it doesn't mean they should be characterised as temples. Yes, the T-shaped pillars were decorated, and such decoration is no random act by people with nothing better to do. The decoration means something. It likely means the circular enclosures were important, but it doesn't have to imply the structures were temples. Because, in all honesty, we don't know with any certainty what the iconography is even telling us. All we can say is that the imagery does have a clear narrative style about it, a narrative important to the culture that created it. Just look at the imagery on this pillar. It's carefully crafted to say something. It's not just a random jumble of images. This fox next to the arm on a central pillar in enclosure D isn't random either. It's saying something important, either about the culture that made it, or about the purpose of this specific structure. And as well as considering the decoration, it's rarely said that the shapes and sizes of the pillars could simply be that way to support a roof. The circular enclosures were in use for several hundred years, and there is not several hundred years of weathering and erosion on these pillars, in a landscape that was constantly hit by rain. They were almost certainly covered by a roof during their lifetime. So, could the circular enclosures be ritualistic? Yes, of course it is possible and we can't rule it out. But due to their position within the settlement, I think it's more likely they were functional, maybe storehouses for food, and that's why they are located centrally inside the settlement to protect them from outside threats, and also why they are semi-subterranean in nature, to help regulate the temperature. But if that's the case, why decorate the pillars? Well, having a more mundane function doesn't make them unimportant. In fact, it would be the opposite. Food storage structures are the life force and beating heart of a settlement, and such a function would make them the most important structures at Göbekli Tepe. And maybe the iconography was still ritualistic and spiritualistic, being the ancient people's way to protect the food. Or perhaps the iconography is related to the seasons, as per the possible interpretation I detailed in a recent video, and was somehow related to how and when the stored food was to be consumed, or when it was caught or collected. At the pre-pottery Neolithic A site of Jerf El Amar, at least one semi-subterranean circular building contained a higher than normal concentration of cereals, and this has been interpreted as a silo. This circular structure was also surrounded by rectangular domestic buildings, similar to what we see at Göbekli Tepe. I'll discuss this more in a future video, because I do have a lot more to say. Interpreting the iconography on the pillars may actually be an impossible task, but I do love how it makes me wonder. We don't know the history of the people that lived here, we don't know their myths, legends and belief system, there is no written word or oral tradition, and excavations are lifetimes away from being complete. It's a puzzle we are unlikely to completely solve because Göbekli Tepe is like a jigsaw puzzle but without a picture to work from and more than half the pieces missing. To summarise what I've just said, Göbekli Tepe was likely always a large settlement with important semi-subterranean circular enclosures at its heart. The purpose of these enclosures could be functional, spiritual or seasonal, or maybe all three, but I don't think we can or should classify it as a temple, especially in the modern sense. Misconception number 3. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. Another misconception often heard and then recited by many is that the circular enclosures were built, used, and then the whole site was ritually and intentionally buried. Although archaeologist Nesmi Carroll does see evidence of the purposeful burial of some of the enclosures at Karahan Tepe due to the slope of the infill layers defying the natural land topography and hence gravity, the same may not actually be the case with Göbekli Tepe. The circular enclosures were situated in a hollow, being semi-subterranean, and certainly since the pre-pottery Neolithic B, and maybe even from day one, domestic rectangular buildings surrounded them, and these were situated higher up. Because of this, gravity was a real problem. There was pressure being exerted on the circular enclosures below, from 3 different sides, especially as more and more rectangular structures were built around them. Some of the circular enclosures show clear phases of rebuilding in the same location. Over time they get smaller and smaller, with new circular walls built inside the older enclosure. This is the reason why the positions of the T-shaped pillars should not be thought of as physical astronomical markers to line up with the stars on the horizon as some say, because the pillars moved as the walls moved inwards. We have no idea what their original position was, and we don't know which pillar went where. So, why did the circular enclosures get smaller and smaller and the walls move inwards? The answer is slope slides, i.e. the land collapsing due to gravity and earthquakes. This would not have been uncommon, and there is evidence the surrounding land and structures did collapse into the semi-subterranean circular enclosures. This is likely the reason the ancient people built a retaining wall to help hold back the creeping land. According to research coordinator Dr. Lee Clare, there is good evidence that enclosures C and D were affected by slope slides, and there is evidence of repair work, which looks to try and alleviate this pressure from above. Maybe the slope slides continued over time, and eventually the damage got so bad, or the enclosures became completely engulfed with material, that the decision was made to completely abandon specific enclosures. Then, maybe the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic B simply finished the job that nature started, and filled them up to form a new ground surface. If you read the papers produced by archaeologists working at the site, you'll know that during the pre-pottery Neolithic B, some of the central circular enclosures were being rebuilt and renovated, but some of them were already filled in and completely abandoned, showing that Göbekli Tepe in its entirety wasn't covered with rubble in one ritualistic act. This is a misconception that many get wrong. It was a gradual process. Some enclosures were filled in before the others, and likely it's all because of natural landslides, which compromised their structural integrity and then led to their abandonment. Inside the circular enclosures, the fill is generally made up of rubble, flint tools and animal bone, and this could well be from collapsed structures, but also from rubbish dumps higher up and surrounding them. The animal bones found inside the circular enclosures are not likely an indication that these were special ritualistic feasting structures, but merely the rubbish from a domestic settlement that collapsed into them. Some structures could have been intentionally filled in, or maybe at least in part, but the abandonment and remodelling of the circular enclosures at the heart of the settlement is the focus of ongoing analysis and research. And the latest thinking is that structures became abandoned after slope slides, when they were no longer structurally sound. Experts believe that after the circular enclosures were abandoned, the contours of the buildings and the tops of the T-shaped pillars could have been visible for quite some time as people continued to live at Göbekli Tepe. It probably looked like this. Misconception number 4. Hunter-gatherers could not have built Göbekli Tepe. Another misconception with Göbekli Tepe concerns the use of the term hunter-gatherer for the people that built it. Hunter-gatherer is a term that's used to define how the people that lived there got their food. And why do we call them that? Well, there is no indication that farming took place, not in the archaeology or iconography. We don't find domesticated grains, we don't find domesticated animal bones, and on the decorated T-shaped pillars, we see vultures, scorpions, snakes, uruks, cranes, boars and foxes. We don't see pigs, goats, sheep and cows. Hunter-gatherer does not mean primitive, it just defines a way of life. Yes, they could carve stone vessels and tools from rock. Yes, they could quarry large limestone pillars and create enclosures, but all indications do show that the people hunted animals for food, and also gathered wild crops and cereals from the land. At Göbekli Tepe, we find wild barley, wild einkorn, wild wheat, as well as almonds and pistachios. The people also dug rock-cut basins to collect rainwater. We need to forget our preconception of what a hunter-gatherer is and appreciate that this is actually what an 11,000-year-old hunter-gatherer settlement actually looks like. A lifestyle choice that would eventually die out as the more sustainable Neolithic practices spread through the region. It's the new Neolithic lifestyle that probably killed Göbekli Tepe, as people, cultures and practices merged, evolved and migrated. What we see at Göbekli Tepe is a snapshot of a hunter-gatherer culture, a culture of builders and artists, but also a culture that hunted food and gathered wild crops, and that doesn't make them primitive nomads. Göbekli Tepe emerged at the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of time that probably wasn't even fit for agricultural practices in some parts of the world. When the climate warmed up, people obviously settled and built at Göbekli Tepe, and they clearly continued to catch and collect food the same way they must have done for centuries before. The iconography that's etched onto the pillars does preserve the narratives that belong to the culture, whether myths, legends, stories, seasons, stars or something else. And with their lifestyle and culture under threat from the encroaching Neolithic practices of farming and animal husbandry, maybe the people chose to etch their culture in stone, to keep it alive and to celebrate it and preserve it. The culture that built Göbekli Tepe has origins and roots that go back way before any T-shaped pillar was ever erected, but it's what's on these T-shaped pillars that tells us so much about them. If only we could understand it. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.